Hello, my name is Emily Grancolis. I'm a Digital Communications Associate at the Pacific Council for International Policy, and I am pleased to introduce Alice C. Hill, the author of The Fight for Climate After COVID-19. Ms. Hill is a Senior Fellow for Climate Change Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, she served as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council, and led the DHS leadership group responsible for biosecurity and biopreparedness efforts, including pandemic planning efforts. Her book, Building Resilient Tomorrow, co-authored with Leonardo Martina-Diaz, was published in 2019 as well. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited to hear about your new book.
I'm delighted to join you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I guess we could start with why decide to write about COVID and the climate crisis?
Well, as we saw in early 2020, the disease began to spread. I had worked on pandemics in the past, and I realized that here before all of our eyes was unfolding a catastrophic risk. And I knew from my work on climate change that that is another catastrophic risk, in fact, worse than a pandemic. And I thought, I bet there are a lot of parallels between these two. I was pretty sure of that based on my prior work, and I decided to start following that, and then soon became clear that there were many parallels and that we could use what we learned from the pandemic, for example, that we need to rely on science, that leadership matters, that this is a borderless disaster, meaning it crosses all those borders humans have carefully crafted, that there were lessons to be harvested from the pandemic that could lead to better outcomes when it came to the catastrophic risk that is climate change.
And what are some of those things that you think the COVID-19 crisis has taught us about dealing with the climate crisis?
Well, it first should have taught us that early action matters. If you compare the experience of two countries, our own, and I will note that we have just surpassed a very grim record. We've had more deaths in the United States from COVID-19 than we had during the 1918 Spanish flu. But if you compare our experience with that of South Korea, you see there's a big difference when leadership acts early. The COVID-19 disease was first detected on the very same day in the United States and South Korea. In the United States, we had President Trump saying essentially something to the effect, it's no big deal, it's just one case. And we had South Korea mobilize like an army. They immediately stood up testing. In fact, they borrowed the model from Starbucks to have drive-through testing. Now, South Korea is obviously a smaller country than the United States, some 56 million versus our 330 plus million. But they decided to start tracking vigorously what could occur in their country and stop it at the outset. And that has continued to this day. They've had about 2,000 plus deaths as a result of COVID-19. And I credit that to the leadership acting immediately to make sure they really contained what could be, as we've seen, a very deathly and damaging illness. So leadership matters and early action matters are two obvious ones. Another is to not treat this as something you can contain by simply closing your borders. When I first started working in this area, I heard the expression a borderless disaster. That is what a pandemic is. It's going to cross your borders no matter how much you try. And climate change does the exact same thing. So if you look at what we need to do, we need to find ways to plan together to reduce the overall risk for both of these threats.
What do we need to understand about the world that we should be preparing for and preparing to address the climate crisis in? What is our new reality post-COVID?
Well, I think this is the very hardest thing. It's the most basic aspect of climate change, but it's really the hardest thing for people to come to grips with. And that is put it simply, that our climate is no longer stable. You know, we in human civilization has flourished during a period of 6,000, 8,000 years where the climate was remarkably stable. But with climate change, which is caused obviously by carbon pollution and other greenhouse gases being emitted primarily by humans, by driving, by power plants, by our means that we construct buildings, by food waste, we are emitting all these things, causing this pollution to rise around the globe, and that pollution now has formed a blanket. And that blanket retains the heat. It's a lot like when you were a kid and you went to bed and it was a cold night and your mom came in and put a blanket over you. In the middle of the night, you might wake up and feel really hot because your body heat had been trapped underneath that blanket. And that's what we're seeing today. So we will continue to heat up because of this thickening blanket of emissions. That's why it's so important that we cut our emissions and then that we try to contain the heat. Now, with the heat comes remarkable changes. 2020 and 2021, in the midst of the pandemic, has shown us a few of what these changes could look like and how powerful they are. And with an unstable climate, and we are moving into greater and greater instability because of that more heat, we will experience more intense storms. So we see as they go over the Gulf of Mexico, the water's hot there, and the storms get really big and powerful very quickly, making it difficult for people to evacuate. We saw in California a 1,000,000-acre fire. We didn't have a word for that fire until that year, gigafire. We had never seen 1,000,000 acres burn. And then we saw extreme heat this year, heat waves that caused the Portland, Oregon public transportation system to shut down because the power lines began to sag in all that heat and they couldn't transmit the power. And that is just the time that we most want power. We see an inability for our systems to generate power. Same thing happened with extreme cold, and one of the concerns is we're going to have greater variability, greater instability with climate change. That extreme cold, those Arctic temperatures in Texas, people froze in their beds because it just, the power system couldn't produce the heat that was needed at that moment. So we're seeing these cascading failures of critical infrastructure, communication systems, power systems, transportation, wastewater treatment. Once the wastewater treatment plants don't have power, they can't operate. And so we have seen massive spills of untreated sewage, for example, in Massachusetts during Sandy. And then we saw just recently with Ida, we hadn't built protections around the subway entrances or closed the intake grates so that there were waterfalls occurring right in the subway station, endangering lives, endangering trains, and that water was often mixed with untreated wastewater. So we are just not prepared is the bottom line. And one of the things we've done all through history is we've made decisions about what will keep us safe based on what we've experienced in the past. And that has been, in a stable climate, a generally good rule. That if you plan for the worst storm that has been experienced and you prepare for that, you'll probably be safe in the next big storm. But that's not true anymore. And our engineering standards haven't changed. Our land use planning hasn't changed. You know, we've had more Americans move into areas at risk in recent decades than move out of those areas. That means areas at risk of wildfires, because wildfires get bigger, hotter, and they create their own fire weather, a fire-nado, more lightning strikes. And we've had more people move into those areas that are highly vulnerable to wildfire. So it's going to require us to really rethink from the bottom up all of the choices about human-made systems as well as our natural systems in the face of climate extremes. Just think of hydropower. If you've got a lot of evaporation, which occurs with greater heat and drought, you don't get power, and that's just the time people want it. And you may not have adequate water supplies. So we need to rethink everything, and that's hard for people to come to grips with. But that is the reality, and we need to do that as we transition as well to green energy and in activities that don't cause as much carbon pollution going forward.
So you started your climate work on the adaptation side of climate. Are the adaptation and mitigation efforts intertwined here as far as moving forward?
Well, I hope they would be, but they have historically been quite divided. And that's because often people start working in climate on one side or the other, either the mitigation, which is cutting the harmful pollution to keep heating from occurring, or the adaptation, which is how do we deal with all these impacts like hotter weather, sea level rise, more extreme precipitation that falls like a rain bomb, as some emergency managers call it. So you have these two sides, and most people have developed an expertise in one or the other. And there, frankly, has been some tension between the two sides. Most experts have concentrated on the effort to cut emissions because that effort, frankly, started about the late 1980s when a scientist, Jim Hansen, testified before Congress saying it was basically certain that we were heating up, the planet was heating up as a result of human activity. And after that, you started seeing UN meetings and a lot more attention to how do we control that heating. Unfortunately, up to now, those efforts have not resulted in the reduction of the carbon pollution that we need to have happen. So we've had greater growth in the adaptation efforts, although that is much smaller in comparison to the efforts to cut emissions. And the adaptation needs to go forward even if we win the fight to cut emissions because of the delayed heating that, under the blanket, it takes a while. So we'll be dealing with these impacts for several decades, even if we get to zero emissions. And that tension has meant that the two sides, the mitigation and adaptation, probably haven't communicated as well. But as the events become more extreme, as the need to transition rapidly to greener sources of energy, for example, the two issues collide. And you can get what some call maladaptation, making a choice to adapt that could hurt you. An example of that would be deciding, and in California we see investment in desalination plants, deciding to invest in a desalination plant, which is a natural instinct. I remember being in the White House and we were talking about how do we get more fresh water and protect fresh water sources, and somebody says, oh, desalination. But with desal, you have to be really careful because if you use traditional sources, fossil fuel sources of power, you are going to create a lot of emissions because desalination is a process that requires huge amounts of energy. And as this effort grows worldwide, we see some countries going deep on desalination. For example, Saudi Arabia, which contributes about 25% of its fossil fuel resources to this effort. But that's a lot of emissions going into maintaining fresh water supplies. On the flip side, you could have something, they call it malmitigation. California has also experienced this. When you invest deeply in solar power, which is a green form of energy, if you have wildfires, those wildfires intersect with the production of energy because the ash and the smoke reduce the effectiveness as they fall on those panels. Those solar panels reduces the effectiveness of the generation of solar power. And that can cause people to turn to diesel-generated energy in their own personal generators or the reopening of fossil fuel plants to generate power. And it happens during those wildfires. It's typically a hot time of year, so that's just, again, when people most want power. So we need to make sure that we understand how each of these efforts, as you have said, intersect and interact with one another so that we are thinking through, okay, if we make this choice to cut emissions, what does that mean in terms of adaptation and vice versa? And that means that these two groups need to work more closely together going forward.
I know that there's also issues around, I think you mentioned like climate literacy or just understanding what's going on with climate change and where we're at now. Because it's such a big issue, how would you recommend leaders begin to tackle it? Where should they start?
Well, we do have a climate literacy problem. And I think if you look at who the leaders are in charge and their age, it's not surprising that we have a climate literacy problem because, as I've said, this really came up in the late 1980s, was picking up the climate issue, picked up steam in the 1990s. Many of our current leaders were educated before that, so it wasn't part of their course of study. And then we have had, over time, a deep division among in the media about whether this is something real. We had a president who said it was a hoax. And so that has caused people to perhaps not as engage as deeply. In fact, I think many Americans, although they believe climate change is happening, do not yet understand that virtually all climate scientists, and I speak as a former judge, agree that climate change is primarily human caused. There is really no issue there, but we sometimes hear that there is an issue, but that's just not good information. There's no issue among the vast majority, and in fact, in a court of law, there would be no argument as a judge. The proof is overwhelming that it's human caused. So you have disinformation, you have people who weren't educated, and then if you look at who's in charge, as NYU Stern Business School did in 2019, it looked at the resumes of all the Fortune 100 directors. So that's 1,188 people. And it did a survey and it determined that just 5 people had a background in either climate change or water. Water is a big issue with rising temperatures. So 5 people, not 5%, out of 1,188 who were making major decisions about corporate risk. And so that's why we see that FM Global, a huge analytics and insurance firm, said that it found about 75% of corporate leaders did not appreciate and have plans to deal with the kind of climate impacts that are upon us. So we have this big climate literacy problem, and I think that to fix it, one step will be greater regulation, to require companies to look inward, determine what are the risks that my operations, my facilities, the ability of my people to get to work, my supply chains. You know, we've seen with Hurricane Maria dramatic impacts on supply chains. We saw that hurricane hit Puerto Rico and knocked out power for a year. Turned out that in Puerto Rico, we had a massive manufacturing hub for pharmaceuticals. And that one event and the loss of power had an immediate effect on medical supplies. So if you think of intravenous bags, those bags that deliver saline solution, might deliver some medicines. Once Hurricane Maria knocked out the power, and even though the pharmaceutical companies struggled, they had generators, they found their people couldn't get to work, manufacturing plummeted for a highly sophisticated product. So you couldn't just go and open another factory the next day. There are obviously very precise specifications for what these bags need to look like and be like. And when that occurred, prices for these bags shot up by 600%. So then hospitals said, oh my God, we can't get these bags. We're going to use syringes. A syringe shortage followed. So companies need to understand how these impacts will affect their supply chains, their people, their operations. And the fastest way for that to occur now, because voluntary measures, market measures, it hasn't happened. The fastest way for that to occur now is to require regulation, which is exactly what we did after the 1929 stock market crash. We told companies, you need to disclose these material risks to you. Climate change is a material risk, but we're just not seeing the level of disclosure that we need yet. And then we need to make sure that as follow-on, which hope will happen, we start training people. We need our schools to start emphasizing climate change. You know, many schools, if you're a 17-year-old who wants to go get educated, and you type in climate change at the college you're looking at or the university, you won't see a course of study pop up. Even though climate change affects everything, it's still kind of helter-skelter. So we had one dramatic example of this just this year. Emory University medical students protested. They said, we're first-year medical students. You, medical school, aren't offering us any education on climate change, but our patients are going to be hit with more heat, with diseases spread by mosquitoes, algae blooms that can cause ill health, by tick-borne diseases, by respiratory problems from wildfire, and you're not teaching us anything about it. And to the credit of Emory University, they changed and now they offer it, but that's the exception to the rule. I have been working on this for over a decade, and most medical, public health, and nursing schools still do not teach on a routine basis. They might have a elective, but they do not teach this risk yet. And that's what we need to see, that kind of emphasis on having people understand this very unfamiliar threat that has never happened in human history and get a deeper understanding of what it's at stake so they can improve their own decision-making and the decision-making in their particular disciplines or businesses.
What do leaders or policymakers need to do to make sure we can tackle this pretty vast existential threat that's facing us?
Well, one thing I saw when I worked in the White House, and this was very evident very quickly, is that the urgent typically overcomes the important. And climate change has been an important thing for people to work on, but it just doesn't get the focus because you have a threatened terrorist attack, you have your electric grid threatened by something, you have a cyber attack, you have a crisis of immigration, you name it, you have an oil spill. So the leaders are often thrown into more of a response mode than a preparedness mode. With climate change, it really pays off, as we've said, with leadership that's focused on preparing and making choices now that will lead to a better future. So how do you get the important to move to the urgent? Well, I think that's what you're seeing across the board right now. We had this very important report by the scientists who came together. This is scientists from 60 nations, about 200 climate scientists, and issued this report that said it's dire. In this, if you look at the executive summary of that report, that's a consensus document. About 190 nations are party to this effort. So that means all 190 nations signed off on that executive report saying that we are heating up very quickly now, that we need to cut our emissions, and we need to cut them dramatically by 2030. We have a very small window to avoid completely unmanageable heating in the future because of that delayed effect. So you see the scientists saying it as plainly as they can, it's now. You see leaders convening in Glasgow with lots of calls for greater action. And you see youth activists coming forward because they know that they're the ones that will be stuck with these decisions that have not accounted for climate change. So you see many people calling for this to be treated as an urgent matter. A big test is coming up, whether when all the nations that are a party to the UN Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement reached in 2015 come forward and say, yes, we are going to cut our emissions. We're going to help the developing nations with substantial amounts of money so that they can transition to green energy, plus they can plan for these impacts that could make their whole country disappear if they're a small island nation. And so that meeting will happen in November in Glasgow, Scotland, and I think for most of those who follow these issues, it's viewed as a very significant point, truthfully, in the history of humanity, whether leaders will be able to turn the tide on climate change. And if we don't act in now what's a very short time frame, we have really handed off a very hot and getting hotter world to ourselves, our children, and future generations.
At the beginning of your book, you do have an excerpt from Earthrise, which is a poem from the U.S. Youth Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman, kind of a tongue twister. But it touches on youth being active in the climate crisis and calling for change. And before COVID, we saw a lot of school walkouts from students. What would you recommend young people ask their elected representatives to do or get involved in?
Well, given events, I think we all have been turned into climate voters. And I think that anyone who can vote or who can influence elections should be looking at whether the person that's asking for support is going to do something about climate. So that's a pretty easy place to start. There was a recent poll that was very saddening to me, showing it was a poll across 10 countries, I think 15,000 young people from the age of 16 to 25, and many of them, I think it was over 70% or more, expressed despair over the current state of the world and fear over climate. That is very troubling and disturbing. We want young people to feel enthusiastic and excited about life and what's ahead. So despite those feelings, my one piece of advice is engagement. And I share that personally from myself. People ask me, how do you keep working on climate change and not get so depressed or distressed, because it is bleak at times? And I was speaking to part of a project that Yale sponsors for talking about climate change, and I was speaking to one of our members who's an evangelist, and he said, working on climate change brings me great joy. And I thought, wow, that's how I feel. I feel that because I'm part of trying to find solutions, I wake up excited every day about what I can do, what we can do, in a way that being passively watching it, I think, leaves people even more despondent. So for anyone who is interested, I urge you to get involved. You can do that in a democracy, through our voting efforts. But also for young people, if you seek out information about climate change, make yourself a person knowledgeable about climate change, you can bring great value to your workplace. Because, as I've said, there is a climate literacy problem. People will become desperate for climate information. And one thing about climate change right now is that no one can say you have to have this degree, this background, this experience in order to be an expert on these issues. Expertise is needed across the board in every discipline. So anyone can start educating themselves and make a contribution, because right now we are so behind. And the level of understanding in many businesses, schools, institutions is so low that all of us can help change that picture and then bring greater action to keep us all safe. Can I just add, I've had a really wonderful, for me, career. I got to be a federal prosecutor, chasing white-collar criminals, people who robbed banks not with a gun but with a briefcase. I got to be a state court judge in California and see really all the issues that end up in courts, from family disputes to rape and robbery to civil litigation over an operation that went bad and somebody's injured. And all of those experiences were truly engaging, and I felt lucky to be a part of them. But I have never been more engaged than I am right now with this issue of climate change. There's nothing that requires more creativity, curiosity, and the willingness to try to learn and work with others than climate change. And so I view it as a tremendous opportunity, even though I feel really grateful for all the chances I had to work, including on other issues that are very compelling, like pandemics, biological threats from an aerosolized anthrax attack where anthrax spores are spread all over the place, to in a mass terrorist event, to human trafficking and working on trying to find ways to rescue those who are trafficked and essentially put into a modern slavery. But nothing is as compelling, urgent, and nothing captures my attention more than this, because of its importance, but also because it's new. It needs creativity. It needs more people focused on the issue so that we can have a more resilient future going forward.
What would you say should be our biggest takeaway from how we've dealt and other places have dealt with the COVID-19 crisis when it comes to dealing with climate change?
Well, leadership matters, acting early matters, and preparedness matters. It was Dwight Eisenhower who said that plans are useless, but planning is essential. Now, of course, before he was president, he led Allied troops in World War II. He recognized that we're never going to be able to game out how a war will unfold or how climate change will unfold, but it's critical that we focus on the planning process. That planning process, in his words, steeps the decision makers in the issue. It causes the decision makers to form the relationships that will help them make sure that when the bad thing is unfolding, they know where to turn, they know what the resources are, what the capabilities are. And so for the United States here, we need to cut our emissions, and President Biden is working on a plan to do that with Congress. But we also need to have a national adaptation plan. Now, that plan won't decide every move that the federal government or state, local, tribal governments will make, or the private sector, but it could establish a framework to help us prioritize the choices we need, to help us have decision makers understand what the federal government can and cannot do to help them, and to figure out how we're going to get over these jurisdictional boundaries that humans have been crafting for as long as anyone knows, but will hinder rather than help efforts to be prepared. You know, we have some 90,000 different jurisdictions within the United States, from a school district all the way up to the federal government. And climate change, like a pandemic, just sweeps across those borders. So how can we help communities, and a national adaptation plan would help this, understand that we need to think through what the risks are as a region, one community's decision. For example, if they're the upstream community and they decide to put a dam across a river, that's going to have some real consequences for the downstream when you're talking about hotter temperatures, which means that the water flow is reduced. Same thing with the seawall. You build a seawall in front of one house, it's going to shoot the water around to the two adjoining houses. So we need to figure out how do we work together, plan together, and make sure that we are making the most informed choices we could with the limited resources that we have, so that we're not wasting money.
Is there one big takeaway that you really want people to walk away with after reading this?
My big takeaway for everyone is that climate change will affect and has affected all of us. The time to act is now, and we must reduce our harmful carbon pollution, even as we think through how we will be prepared. Everyone needs to remember that the last bad event will, in all likelihood, be exceeded by the next bad event. So when you read in the paper, it's a quote, and it happens almost daily. Somebody says, I've lived here for 30, 40, 10 years, and I've never seen anything like this before. Well, climate change, that's what happens. The last big storm is exceeded by the next bigger storm, and we need to think through what does that mean and how can we be better prepared. So, basic message is it's beyond time to act on climate.
So I know there's some concern possibly over cost. What do you say to people who ask, aren't these things going to cost a lot?
Yes, these things cost a lot, but I think that we have had almost a false dichotomy here between the cost of transitioning to energy and the assumed costs of climate change. The economic modeling that has been done by some very famous economists just hasn't captured the costs that are beginning to be revealed here now from the relatively modest climate impacts that we're already experiencing. And I'll give you an example of that that's really based right on in California. The Californians have now been subjected to preemptive shutdowns of their power. The sixth largest economy in the world's response to the growing wildfire risk is just to shut down power. So for those who suffer along power, that could mean everything in their freezers destroyed. That's not going to be picked up in the economic models. It could mean that the local dialysis center, as we saw in New York during Sandy when they lost power, can't operate. So 6,000 patients lose dialysis treatments. It can mean that we're going to see wildfire smoke that neighboring communities breathe that contains lead contaminants and other ill health producing impacts. The economic models aren't going to pick up that. Wildfire often happens in very strong heat events. We're going to have excess deaths, as we've seen from that. Economic models may not pick up that. We're going to have lots of people displaced. The people of Paradise, we had 20,000 people essentially rendered homeless, and many of them descended on Chico, a town of about 100,000, which caused housing costs to shoot up. Schools became more crowded, roads became more congested. It's hard for the economic models to pick that up. We see a growing crisis of unavailability of insurance in California. The California Commissioner has imposed moratoria on insurance companies, telling them they can't cancel fire insurance or fail to renew fire insurance in communities close to areas that have been hit by fire. That cannot be sustained for a long time. Why do the insurance companies want to do that? Because they cannot offer affordable insurance given the growing fire risk. We see that, and you saw this on Route 1, that iconic road that unfurls along the beautiful California coast. We see after wildfires we get mudslides because the hardened packed earth is scorched, and then heavy rains fall and it causes a slide. In California, there's a risk in Northern California where some water is stored in the mountains as dams were built, and those reservoirs are in the mountains. If there's fires near there, it could be very damaging to freshwater resources. That's just one example, and I haven't captured all the negative economic fallout from simply wildfires, but we can extrapolate that the economic costs are going to be dire. In fact, Swiss Re, which is one of the world's largest reinsurance companies, those are the insurers that insure the primary insurers like State Farm and Allstate. These are the insurance companies that insure them against big risks. And Swiss Re has said that by 2050, gross domestic product worldwide could drop 18% because of climate change. So we just didn't understand how and we still don't fully understand how climate risk unfold. And unfortunately, the economic modeling, I think, lulled us into inaction because it simply couldn't capture all of the impacts and costs involved. It only captured a relatively few, which can lead to an underestimation of what's really at stake.
So the Pacific Council likes to focus on issues where they can draw a local to global connection, and I think that's definitely happening with climate change. And because it's a problem that's beyond borders, that means solutions will be as well. And I'm wondering if you have any examples of either local communities or communities around the world that have been coming up with solutions to dealing with climate change that we could possibly look to or learn from?
Well, I think we see that across the board. You know, these impacts come in very locally. But of course, the cause of the warming, the blanket of pollution, is a global problem. It's contributed by many people. There are some larger contributors. The United States is the largest historically contributor, and per capita, per person, we're a very large contributor, something like, I think we cause emissions, each of us, 65 times more than those people in Bangladesh. I could be off, but it's an extraordinary multiplication of the amount that we have. And if you're looking for solutions, however, on the adaptation side, we can all learn from each other. And a very obvious example of that for California would be to learn from Australia and from Greece and from Canada as they suffer from these massive wildfires. What works? How do you do your controlled burns? What kind of land use policies do you have? Do you let people rebuild in an area that has suffered a burn, even though we know that if it's burned before, it's likely to burn again? And if they want to rebuild, do you require insurance companies to insure them? How do governments get people out of areas at risk? What are the incentives that can encourage people to make better decisions and understand? Everyone's working to solve these problems, and we can certainly share what the best practices are and what may not work as well, so that we can leapfrog together in building a safer world. Right now, largely, we're asking each community to reinvent the wheel, which seems not very efficient, and it risks not bringing the greatest information, creativity, innovation together to really make sure that we're thinking through what could work and leading to success.